Recording. All right. So good evening, everybody. It's been a while since we met between various holidays and then a fifth Thursday in the month and so on. So nice to gather virtually with you all once again. And so the topic for this evening is Israel a state of the Jews or a state of its citizens? I was prompted to discuss this, and I mean, let me preface it as I often do by saying that any opinions that I expressed during the course of the class tonight are my opinions. They are not the opinions of Kehilat Shalom, of the Rabbinical Assembly, of the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, of the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, of the International Zionist Conspiracy, or any other organization, real or imagined. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second is that these are just sort of thoughts and seeds of thought and seeds of discussion. But I was prompted to look at this question by a couple of different things in media within the last few weeks. One was an article by Rabbi Daniel Gordis. Some of you may be familiar with him. He's written lots and lots of books about Israel. He's a columnist. He's appeared in Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, the Times of Israel. He's, very well-known guy. We actually shared an office suite for a year at the Ziegler School of Rabbinical Studies in LA. So I've known him for a long time. And, sometimes I agree with him, sometimes I disagree, but he's always a very thoughtful commentator on the Israeli scene. And because he grew up in the States and he made Aliyah when he was, in his 30s, he understands the American Jewish community in ways that a lot of Israeli writers and thinkers don't. But he had an article, I'll quote from it at some length later on, but where he highlighted Israel's decision not to make exceptions. So, back at the beginning of the pandemic, Israel closed its borders pretty much to everybody. And then, they were gradually opened again. And then back in November, when Omicron first started hitting, closed it again. And it really caused a rift between Israel and at least some members of the American Jewish community and the American Jewish, for lack of a better term, the American Jewish establishment, right? Because there's this whole class of people who spend billions flying back and forth between Israel and the States, right? I mean, people who have kids who've made Aliyah, who have grandchildren in Israel, who, may live in the States, but also own an apartment in Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and couldn't get in. And so that was one thing. And then the converse of that, the Hartman Institute, which you should be familiar with, we've used some of their adult education programs in the past, but they did a podcast. It was actually There was unusual for them. There was no topic. Like, every once in a while I'll do an Ask the Rabbi session. So this podcast was You Ask, We Answer. And it was three different scholars from Hartman. And one of the questions that was asked was about Israel's decision. I wrote about this on Monday, to let in birthright groups over winter vacation, but to not let in Christian pilgrims, and whether they thought that this was, a fair decision. So it crystallized for me some of the questions about, what exactly to whom does the state of Israel have an obligation, right? In other words, does Israel have an obligation to its citizens, whether they are Jewish or non-Jewish, or should non-Israeli Jews have some sort of special status within Israel? Right now, look, nobody in their right mind, for example, ever proposed that Israel should say, Jewish tourists can come, but not non-Jewish tourists, right? I mean, that would look very bad, right? But they could say, non-Israelis who own homes in Israel could come, right? Which would be 99% Jews, but it wouldn't be, right, a statement that Jews could come, right? Or they could say, people with Israeli grandkids could come, okay? With again, now, of course, that would be smaller than 99%, right? Because I'm sure that there are, Palestinian Americans who have grandkids who are Israeli citizens, right? So that would be, maybe a more problematic category. But these kind of crystallize some of the things that I'm thinking about. So I want to start by a book, looking at the title of a book that in many ways, I mean, it's a weird, when you're dealing with Jewish history, right? One rule of Jewish history is there's no the first anything, right? I mean, if you look at the sort of the standard histories of the American Jewish community, right? When did the first Jews come to what is now the United States? 1654, right? 23 Jews who were traveling from Recife, which was a Dutch colony in what is now Brazil, but the Portuguese had conquered it, brought the Inquisition with them. So the Jews in Recife were seeking to go back to the Netherlands, were blown off course, wound up in New Amsterdam, right? The 23 first Jews in what is now the United States, right? Okay, so here's the thing, right? If these are the 23 first Jews in what is now the United States, how is it that there was already one Jew in New Amsterdam who came down to the docks to meet them, right? So there's never any first anything, right? And similarly, if I ask you who founded Zionism, right, you would say Theodor Herzl, right? Everybody agree Theodor Herzl founded Zionism, right? Yes? No? Right? Except there were proto-Zionist books before that. Moses Hess, Leon Pinsker, etc. But Herzl, to be fair, did found the institutions of the Zionist movement, and his sort of blueprint for Zionism, which he wrote in German, was called Der Judenstaat. Okay, now I don't know German, right? But I mean, I learned enough in grad school to be able to properly pronounce words of 2 or 3 syllables, right? But Der Judenstaat, right? But that book is known in English as the Jewish state, right? But in Hebrew, it's known as Midinat HaYehudim, right? Not Ha-Midina HaYehudit, which would be the Jewish state, but Midinat HaYehudim, which means what? The state of the Jews, right? Not the Jewish state, but the state of the Jews. Now, again, I don't know German, but from my reading in secondary literature, the state of the Jews is a more accurate translation of Der Judenstaat than the Jewish state. Okay, now, throw it out there. What's the difference between the Jewish state and the state of the Jews? What's the difference? I mean, is that just a semantic difference, or is there a substantive difference between those two concepts?
There's a substantive difference between the two.
Okay, in what sense?
In what sense? One means that the Jewish state could mean the state like a country or everything, but the state of the Jews means the condition of the Jews as they were at the time.
Okay, that's true too, but not in Hebrew, because Medina means state as a political subdivision.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Well,
the state in that sense would be Matzav, not Medina.
Okay.
Okay.
That's my lack of understanding of Hebrew.
Okay, no, fair enough. I mean, it's just one of the things that shows you how treacherous an activity translation really is.
It is, yes.
Right? Because the state of the Jews, and it's perfectly reasonable for you to think the state of the Jews means the condition of the Jews, right? And not the political subdivision of the Jews. But now that we've clarified that, right, is there a difference between the Jewish state and the state of the Jews? Yeah, Gail.
So the Jewish state sounds like it's going to be Jewish, and the state of the Jews says that's what the Jews are, but it doesn't say it would just be exclusively Jews, I think.
Okay. All right, but the Jewish state, okay, fair enough. The state of the Jews, who does it belong to?
The Jews.
The Jews. Which Jews?
The ones that live there, maybe.
I don't think so.
No.
Right?
All Jews.
All Jews. If it's the state of the Jews, right, it belongs to all Jews whether they live there or not. Right? Whereas the Jewish state, it simply describes the nature, right? You could have, in theory, many Jewish states, right? But if there's the state of the Jews, then, at least the way I understand it, definitionally, there could only be one, right? And that therefore the responsibility of Israel as the state of the Jews applies to all Jews, whether they live in Israel or not, whether they're Israeli citizens or not. And conversely, all Jews should have a say in what happens, right? Again, whether or not they live there, whether or not they're citizens, right? And to what extent and how much, these are unresolved questions, right? But so mean, that difference between, you know, Ha-Medina Ha-Yehudit, the Jewish state, and Medinat Ha-Yehudim, the state of the Jews, I think hovers over this whole question. All right, so let me get to some of what Gordis wrote a few weeks ago. Okay, so I'm going to quote him, you know, fairly at length. Okay, when Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, doing his best to delay the inevitable Omicron wave, tried to buy time by closing Israel's skies, he aroused the ire of several groups, including the Israeli tourism industry and American Jews. The difference in perspective between the two communities could be easily seen in two headlines in the Jerusalem Post. The first, Bennett, diaspora is close to my heart, but no travel exceptions, was followed by William Daroff, the exceptionally thoughtful CEO of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, who wrote a measured column in the Post, which the Post summarized with the headline, COVID-19 suspends the implicit Israel diaspora covenant. Okay, that's a pretty strong statement, especially by the president's conference. I mean, the president's conference in and of itself is an interesting group. It was founded in 1956 during the Suez War between, you know, Israel, Egypt, and France. Israel, the UK, and France on the one hand, and Egypt on the other. I mean, it was the only time. I mean, you know, considering like the way things have been, like frankly all of my lifetime, the idea that Israel, Egypt, and France were fighting a war together against Egypt, and the United States was on the Egyptian side, not in terms of like sending them weapons, but in terms of providing them political support. I mean, I know it, but I don't believe it, considering, you know, everything that's happened since then, right? But the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations was essentially created by none other than Dwight David Eisenhower, okay? Because every Jewish organization tried to set up a meeting with the president and said, we represent American Jews and we need to see the president, right? And Eisenhower said, I'm not having 40 meetings with 40 different organizations, right? You guys figure out who represents you and I'll have one meeting. Right, so they created the President's Conference, and today, I mean, there are a lot of organizations that are members of the President's Conference because they sort of, you know, vestigially have always been, but have essentially no constituency, and others that, you know, have fairly significant constituencies, but you know, they could never get the requisite numbers to support them joining the President Conference, like J Street, for example, okay, which, agree or not, is a fairly large, you know, organization that represents a lot of Jews, but they're not a member of the President's Conference, even though they've applied, because, you know, you need some sort of super majority to be admitted, right? But so for William Daroff, who I agree, I don't know him, but I know a lot of people who do know him think very highly of him, and to basically say that, you know, closing down Israel's borders because of COVID is a suspension of the implicit Israel diaspora covenant. I mean, that's a pretty serious statement. Okay, so Gordis goes on. These different attitudes to the relationship have a long history, and we're obviously not going to settle that contentious and often painful issue in this setting. What many people don't realize, though, is the great lengths to which the two communities have gone not to have the honest conversation we've long needed. In fact, the drive to avoid the discussion is as old as the state of Israel itself. We can see the obfuscation even in a very common mistranslation of Israel's Declaration of Independence. Go to the Knesset site and you'll find this in the penultimate paragraph. Okay, so now Gordis is a man after my own heart, right? By railing against mistranslations and how they, how they distort the meaning of things. But this is from the sort of official English translation of the Israeli Declaration of Independence. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Yisrael in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. And Gordis says, that's all well and good, except for the fact that, well, that's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew verb lahitlaked does not mean to rally around, which one can do from New York, Paris, or London. It means to become one physical body with, nor does in the tasks of really appear in the Hebrew. Those words are rendered in Hebrew by a simple letter, the letter bet, which means by. Nor does the Hebrew really say we appeal, it says we call upon. In other words, what the Hebrew says was, we call upon the Jewish people in the diaspora to become one with the Jews of Eretz Yisrael by immigrating and building, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. Okay, so now if you've been to Israel, I mean, you kind of know this, right? That there is this attitude within Israel that's older than Israel itself, known in Hebrew as Shlilat Hagolah, okay, which means, and even that is mistranslation. I mean, it's usually translated as negation of the diaspora, right? But the word Golah, right, which is usually translated to English as diaspora, really doesn't mean diaspora. It really means exile, right? And the choice of words, because there's a Hebrew word for diaspora called tfutzot, right? And what's the difference between exile and diaspora?
Exile means you were pushed out. Diaspora means that you're just scattered.
Right. I mean, the origin of the diaspora could have been in pushed out too, right? But I mean, let me put it a different way. Who here thinks that that as a Jew living in the United States, you are in exile? Right? What you live in the diaspora, right? Exile, and exile is forcibly, right? Diaspora, it may have started forcibly, right? I mean, at least that's the myth, right? The myth is that wherever your ancestors came to the United States from, right? Be that Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe, North Africa, Iran, the Arab world, whatever, right? How did they get there? They got there because they were exiled from Eretz Yisrael, right? I mean, either after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, or after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 CE. Now, point of fact, when the Jews who were forcibly, carried as prisoners to Rome, right? There was already a community in Rome, right? I mean, right, Saint Peter, right, went to Rome, and he was sent originally to the Jews of Rome, right? He didn't have so much success with them, right? But there was a Jewish community in Rome. There were Jewish communities. There was a massive Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt, right? There was, but at any rate, you know, the myth is that the Romans kicked us out and then we spread throughout the world, right? But we're no longer in exile, we're in diaspora because it's voluntary, right? I mean, if you feel that you are in exile, right, there's a very simple way to resolve that, right? Right? How do you resolve that? You go down to the airport, you buy a one-way ticket, no more exile, right? And the fact that and some of us may have chosen to do that at one point, but it didn't work out, and we're here again. But it's voluntary, right? It's voluntary. So we're not in exile, we're in diaspora. But there is this concept in Zionism, which is really as old as Herzl, called Shlilat HaGolah, negation of the exile, which is to say that, I mean, the most benign formulation of Shlilat HaGolah is that Jewish life outside of Israel has no legitimacy, right? A stronger form of Shlilat HaGolah would be that Jewish life in the diaspora has no future, right? Has no future either because of assimilation or anti-Semitism, or both, right? And this is what Herzl felt, that eventually, and that is precisely why for him it was the state of the Jews, that once the Judenstaat was established, fairly soon afterwards, all the Jews of the world would live in der Judenstaat. Why? Because if you wanted to remain Jewish, you would emigrate, right? And if you didn't want to remain Jewish, you would stay in the diaspora and you would assimilate. All right, because for Herzl, anti-Semitism was at least partially a product of the fact that the Jews did not have their own state, right? I mean, you could be an ethnic German living in Italy, right? I mean, there are areas of northern Italy which are ethnically mostly German, right? But there's a German state to look after the interests of those Germans in Italy, right? Throughout, Europe, right? There are ethnic minorities, but by and large, those ethnic minorities have states, and so. But the Jews, one of the reasons, I mean, it wasn't just Herzl who felt this way. It was Pinsker and Hess, that the Europeans in particular hated the Jews because they didn't have a state, and that once we had a state, all of that would disappear. And if you wanted to assimilate, you could assimilate. So in short order, all of the Jews in the world would live in der Judenstaat, right? Now we see that obviously didn't work out that way. In fact, if anything, right, Israel is more a driver of anti-Semitism than a cure for anti-Semitism today, right? I mean, not that you need an excuse to be an anti-Semite, right? But this is what Herzl believed that would happen, right? So. So that discussion of the different perspectives of the legitimacy even of the existence of the diaspora has not really happened, right? And it hasn't happened. It hasn't happened for a number of reasons, right? I mean, among them, the fact that Israel has depended on the American Jewish community for both financial and political support, right? And there is no point in alienating the American Jewish community by denigrating their very existence, right? But it's interesting. I mean, when Netanyahu was in office, right, and Ron Dermer was the ambassador, I mean, they were very explicit, right? We don't depend on the American Jewish community anymore, right? We depend on the evangelicals, right? And so, and frankly, in my opinion, many of these evangelicals would be very happy to see massive Jewish aliyah to Israel, right? Because they may love Israel, but they don't love Judaism and they don't love us. And we, by and large, don't love them, right? And could you imagine, if there were half as many Jews in the United States, right? I mean, considering, we're 2.5%, 3% of the population, but certainly more than 2.5% or 3% of the donations to the Democratic Party come from Jews, right? Certainly more than 2.5% to 3% of donations to Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, et cetera, come from Jews, right? So I am quite convinced that many evangelicals would be very, very happy for there to be fewer Jews. But that debate really, and Gordis thinks that discussion should take place, right? But Daraf's perspective is that we should not be pressured. I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but it seems implicit in what he wrote. We should certainly not be pressured to move to Israel, but we should have some sort of special status in Israel, right? And by not allowing Jews to come to Israel, right, you are breaking that covenant, okay? Then the flip side was in December when Israel did say exactly that. Okay, we'll let in some birthright groups. You all know what birthright is, right? Right? So I don't have to explain that, right? And it wasn't that many. I think they let in like 1,800 kids on birthright trips, right? And they were all, had to present proof of being triple vaxxed before they got on the plane. And then they had to quarantine for 3 days once they got to Israel. But when you read it, I mean, it's a very Jewish way, I have to say, of counting 3 days, right? Because when you're sitting Shiva, it's 7 days, right? But it's not really 7 days. It's 5 days and 2 half days, right? Because the day of the funeral is day 1, and day 7 is only till the middle of the morning, right? So it's really, right? And that was the same thing for the quarantine in Israel, right? Day 1 was the day you got to Israel, right? And day 3 was till like lunch. So it was really, I mean, considering that a lot of flights to Israel get there late afternoon, early evening, it's really more like, a day and a half of actual quarantine, right? But they let in birthright groups, and they didn't let in Christian pilgrims, right? And I mean, the letting in of birthright groups is also because, I mean, a lot of people don't realize this, but birthright is funded I mean, it is funded to a significant extent by American Jewish philanthropists, but it is also funded by the Israeli government. Okay, and the idea is that, look, I don't think the Israeli government is under any illusion that birthright trips are going to result in massive American Jewish immigration, right? But they do feel that they will result in greater Jewish identity, greater identification with Israel, and that's in the interests of Israel. And that's why, I mean, the paradigm of Israel as the recipient, exclusively recipient of American Jewish charitable dollars has been upended. I mean, Israel is funding day schools in this country, and Israel is funding birthright, and Israel is funding all kinds of initiatives in this country. Whether that's good, bad, appropriate or not is I mean, you could discuss it, but there was a lot of blowback that Israel had no business essentially prioritizing Jewish tourists over Christian tourists, right? So on this Hartman podcast, Yossi Klein Halevi defended it. He said, Israel was set up to benefit the Jewish people, and it's absolutely fine that Jews have special status. The other two people said, it doesn't really look good. And they either should have let in an equal number of Christian tourists or not let in the birthright group. And I personally tend to agree. I think it was probably an own goal in terms of PR. I don't feel that strongly about it, but I do tend to agree that it's probably not the smartest thing that they ever did. But that's the flip side. That's the flip side of the coin. But of course, it's not just the Christian pilgrims who suffered by this decision, right? I mean, the economy of Nazareth suffered by this decision, right? And the residents of Nazareth are Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? Bethlehem is in the West Bank. The people who live there are not Israeli citizens. Maybe Israel has a lesser responsibility to them. We could argue that. And then the Christian Court of the Old City is a sort of intermediate state, right? Because Arab residents of the Old City can get Israeli citizenship if they want to, but they mostly choose not to because they consider themselves occupied, and accepting Israeli citizenship is seen as a betrayal. I'm going to stop here. I mean, I always do this. I've been talking a lot. Let me stop here for a moment. If there are any questions, comments, whatever, entertain them, and then we'll go on, because there's certainly more. But I want to give people an opportunity to, hear somebody else's voices beside mine. Yeah, Val. Need to unmute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't it significant that many Arab states who even might consider having connections with Israel of some sort, diplomatic or economic, whatever,
Yeah.
oppose the notion that Israel is a Jewish state? Doesn't that say something?
Well, I'm not sure that they actually do. I mean, and this is a good segue into the next topic. I mean, I think if you look at what's going on between Israel and the Gulf states, okay, I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia yet, although I think there's a lot of unofficial ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia, right? But official ties between Israel and the UAE, between Israel and Qatar, et cetera, and Israel and Morocco, right? I mean, they know who they're dealing with, and they're fostering Jewish life, right? I mean, there are synagogues in the Emirates. You can get kosher food now. In fact, I mean, we know that the Emirates is a real Jewish community because there are two rival chief rabbis, right? Who've excommunicated each other. Okay, I mean, you don't have a real Jewish community until you've got two people claiming to be the head rabbi and they excommunicate each other, right? And you can't. Their food is not really kosher. No, your food isn't really. So, and there's Jewish heritage tourism in Morocco. I mean, Morocco had a huge Jewish community. There's still a sizable Jewish community in Morocco. But, I mean, the Palestinian argument against this kind of normalization is that you've turned your back on the Palestinians. Okay. And I think that that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, I'm not sure that that's necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, which is not to say, look, I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is bad for Israel and bad for the Palestinians. But that doesn't mean that normalizations between Israel and other Arab countries is not a good thing. It is a good thing, right? And to the extent that it allows Israel to feel more accepted within the region, it potentially allows Israel to feel more secure and therefore more willing to take risks for peace, I think. But that's a really good segue. Okay, that's a really good segue, because the next thing that I want to discuss is exactly something that I think has been under the radar in this country, but really significant in Israel, and that is a TV interview that Mansour Abbas gave a few weeks ago. Okay, so for those of you who don't know who Mansour Abbas is, right, Mansour Abbas is the head of the political party called Ra'am, which is an Israeli Arab Islamist political party that's part of the current coalition, right? I mean, it, hopefully know enough, right? So in order to have a coalition, right, because no party in Israel has ever gotten a majority or anything close to it, right? So you have to have 61 out of the 120 seats in the Knesset, and the current government has precisely 61 seats. Okay, and so it is a coalition that's headed by Naftali Bennett, right, who is Orthodox and lives in a settlement in the West Bank, and in terms of his political views, doesn't differ at all from Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay, but two major Israeli political parties, Ra'am and Yisrael Beitenu. Ra'am is I'm sorry. Back that up. Bennett's party, which is called Yamina, rightward, okay, or rightward, and Lieberman's party, Avigdor Lieberman's party, called Yisrael Beitenu, which is mostly a Russian party. And Bennett and Lieberman both have the same job in their past. They were both Netanyahu's chief of staff, okay? And they both feel that he can't be trusted as far as he can be thrown, okay? Which is the general consensus across the board. in Israel, right? But Bennett really didn't disagree with Netanyahu politically, but he didn't trust him, and he felt he was corrupt. And so he has his own party, right? So you have Bennett on the far right, and you have the Islamist party. Can't really call them the far left because they're socially conservative in many ways, right? But they're off the spectrum entirely, right? And then you have Meretz, which is and the Labor Party. I mean, the Labor Party is a left-wing Zionist party. Meretz is a far left-wing Zionist party, and they all manage to function, and the government is functioning. It's actually doing things, which is kind of unusual for Israel, right? But Abbas gave a speech, and he said Israel's status as a Jewish state could not be changed, and he advised the Arab community to follow his pragmatic approach rather than trying to challenge the country's identity. All right, he actually wasn't a TV interview. It was at a conference held by Globes news magazine, which is an Israeli news magazine, but it focuses on the economy. Okay, so it's kind of like the Wall Street Journal or the Economist of Israel. And he's trying to raise his community's profile, working within the government, a strategy that some fellow Arab politicians have criticized as selling out the Palestinian national cause. This is a quote from him. Israel was born as a Jewish state, and that was the decision of the Jewish people to establish a Jewish state. The question is not what is the identity of the state. That's how the state was born, and so it will remain. And he said, this is the reality. The question is not about the state's identity, but what the status of Arab citizens will be in it. Okay, now this is like, I mean, is this news to everybody but me? I just want to confirm that it is, right? Yes, news to everybody but me, right? I mean, this was a big deal, right? Because you have this Islamist, Islamist party saying, look, Israel's a Jewish state, okay? And we're not going to change that, right? We're not going to change it. We Israeli Arabs should not fight against the nature of Israel as a Jewish state, but we want our fair share of the pie, right? We want our fair share of the pie, and the way to get our fair share of the pie is to work within the system, right? Is to work within the system. I mean, in a certain sense, right? You could, if you wanted to track it onto American terms, it's MLK versus Malcolm X, right? Or I don't know, Jim Clyburn versus, I mean, you can't even say like, the Squad or whatever, because they're working within the system too, right? But it's like we get more by working within the system than by trying to, detonate the whole system, right? And so, this is an important accommodation, I think. Val, yeah.
Let's imagine a situation, military, political, diplomatic, economic, whatever you want, and it will take too much time to figure out one example, but let's imagine there is a situation where Israel has to make a decision. Should it hesitate if it takes a decision that it's pro-Jewish, but it's less than perfect democratic?
Right. No, look, so this is exactly the question, right? This is exactly the question when we talk about, Jewish state versus the state of all its citizens, right? And essentially, look, I mean, I've raised this issue in sermons at shul a few times, right? And I always say, who here thinks Israel should be both a Jewish and democratic state? And everybody raises their hand, right? And then I say, what does that mean? And nobody knows, right? Because it can't be 100% of both. It can't be, right? I mean, in a certain sense, right, the law of return is an undemocratic law, right? Because I mean, if you think, right, I mean, I am a third generation Brooklyn born Jew, and I can go to Israel and become a citizen immediately, right? And Rashida Tlaib, right, whose grandmother still lives in the West Bank, she can't go back, right? I mean, there's an element of that being undemocratic, right? I don't challenge it, right? I mean, but there's an element where that is undemocratic and becomes very, very complicated. I mean, I am asked, not that frequently, but not infrequently either, right, to write a letter certifying that somebody is Jewish so that that person can obtain Israeli citizenship, right? That makes me, I mean, it's bad enough that I'm a clerk of the state of Maryland, right? When I sign a marriage certificate, right? But I'm a clerk of the state of Israel, right? I mean, I'm a clerk of a state of which I'm not even a citizen, right? I didn't ask for it, but it was, it was thrust upon me by virtue of being a rabbi, right? So these are complicated questions that have no easy solution, right? I mean,
I for one, I don't have any problem with this choice. I would go with the Jewish solution, period.
right, but here is the problem. I mean, first of all, what does it mean to be a Jewish solution, right? I mean, tzedek tirdof, right? Justice shall you pursue. Part of the Torah, right? Do not oppress the resident alien is in the Torah 36 times, right? I mean, the last time that I was in Israel, which is a while ago already, it was about 7 or 8 years, right? It was during one of the wars between Israel and Hamas, right? And we went to one of the Iron Dome batteries outside of Ashkelon, and we met with one of the pilots who had participated in the bombing raid on the Osirak nuclear reactor. Okay, and he was talking about pilots having the unilateral authority to call off bombing raids if they believe that there will be excessive civilian casualties, right? And he said, as far as I'm concerned, if we didn't do that, it would negate Israel's right to exist. Okay, and everybody looked at him, what are you talking about? And he said, look, He says, I'm an atheist, okay? I'm a Jew, I'm a Jewish atheist, right? But I believe in Jewish values, okay? And the state of Israel was set up not merely to protect Jewish lives, but to perpetuate Jewish values, okay? And one of those values is the value of innocent human life, right? And if we jettison the value of protecting innocent human life, we are no longer living by Jewish values and have forfeited our right to exist. Okay, now I'm sure that he was putting that in a very extreme way to make a point, right? But what exactly the state of Israel exists to do, right? If it's merely to protect Jewish bodies, then yes, right, anything goes. Anything goes, right? It's a cruel world. It's a cruel world. We all know that, right? If we didn't experience it personally, then our parents and grandparents certainly did, right? You know, and there are Jews who say, you know, we got to be ruthless because it's a ruthless world, right? To me, it's a tension, right? In other words, why does the Jewish people exist? All right, the Jewish people exists to live by and perpetuate Jewish values, right? But in order to live by and perpetuate Jewish values, you have to exist, right? So if we have to fight in order to exist, then we have to fight because we can't perpetuate Jewish values if we don't exist at all, right? But the flip side is if we're not perpetuating Jewish values, we don't really have a reason to exist. It's a conundrum. It's no, you know, I mean, you know, I've said this before. Every problem has a solution which is simple, elegant, and wrong, right? And these are complicated questions that have no easy answer, right? And the question of, you know, the nature of Israel as a state of all its citizens, but the nature of Israel as a Jewish state. I mean, optimally, it should be both, right? And the question of how you prioritize one or over the other in cases where the two are in tension. I mean, I think you sometimes prioritize one, sometimes you prioritize the other. I mean, there's a lot more to be said. I don't want to go on too much longer, but I listened. There was another Hartman podcast, which I listened to today, and it was Yossi Klein Halevi, who's one of the more right-wing people in the Hartman faculty, said something very interesting. He says that Israel has a responsibility to two peoples, okay, to the Jewish people and to the Israeli people. Right. And if you know, he didn't use the term Venn diagram, but there's a lot of overlap, right? I mean, you know, roughly 50% of the Jews in the world are part of the Israeli people, right? But 50% are not, right? Roughly 80% of the Israelis are also Jewish, but that means 20% are not, right? And you've got these two overlapping sort of Venn, you know, this overlapping Venn diagram. And I think it's a really good way to put it, but it's very complicated. I mean, when I lived in Israel, right, in the mid 80s, all right, and I'll close with this story and we'll continue in 2 weeks. I was on the board of a camp that was called Keruv Levavot, which means I don't know, bringing hearts together. Okay. And it was a summer camp for Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis so that they would get to know each other and lessen the tensions between the two communities, right? And at one point at board meeting, sometime in the spring, the director of the camp was giving a report on enrollment, and he said, I don't remember the exact numbers, but he said something like, we have 200 Israeli kids signed up and about 100 Arab kids signed up. And I rose my hand and I said, I moved to cancel the camp. And he looked at me and said, what are you talking about? I said, no, we don't have 200 Israelis and 100 Arabs. We have 200 Jewish Israelis and 100 Arab Israelis, right? And if you, as director of the camp, don't see it that way, then there's really no point in holding the camp at all, right? Because that's the whole point, is that Arab Israelis are Israeli, right? And we haven't even spoken about the West Bank or Gaza, right? Where you have a couple of million Palestinians who don't have Israeli citizenship, who essentially have no citizenship whatsoever, right? But even within Israel, you have roughly 20% of the Israeli population who are Israeli citizens, right? And what Abbas is saying, right, is we want to be treated like citizens, right? We want to get our fair share of education funds. We want to get our fair share of roads. We want to get our fair share of police. I mean, you know, in this country, you have people, minority people say, defund the police, right? In Israel, you have Arab Israelis saying, we want more police in our towns. We want more police in our towns because the murder rate is through the roof. We want more police, right? And you know, to me, that should be unquestioned. I mean, if people are Israeli citizens and they're paying taxes and they're voting for the Knesset, and many of them are serving in the army, right? And if they're not serving the army, they're serving the public in other ways. I mean, you know, most American Jews don't know this, right? But roughly 20% of the citizens of Israel are Arab, but more than 20% of the physicians in Israel are Arab, right? And they serve Jewish and Arab Israelis equally. The nurses serve Jewish and Arab Israelis equally. The Arab ambulance, right? So there's a certain reality, and Arab Israel are Israeli, right? They're also Palestinian, right? So everybody has a bifurcated identity, but it's not simple. It's not simple. It's not simple really for anybody. Again, if there's any questions or comments, and if not, we'll continue this in 2 weeks. So thank you for joining. And Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
You.
Night.
It was very